Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is Supercoach Challenges, and today we are looking at something a bit different. So, an important thing to think about when trying to maneuver your team into a better position, I think, is not getting caught up in the scores that happened last week and chasing points. And I think this is something we can all really get caught with, and I feel like it's something I've been caught with this year already. And I wanted to kind of try and illustrate that, and I've created a really long and convoluted spreadsheet, but I think it's kind of interesting to go through and have a look at what players might score based on what we think they should score as an average for the whole year. You could use total points, and having a look at it, I thought actually total points might be a bit more relevant because you probably want to pick players a little bit based on what's their total point output going to be from the rest of the season. But I think average still works, so we'll have a look at it from that perspective anyway. And I've used this spreadsheet, or created this spreadsheet to kind of try and illustrate it. So looking at this, I've picked a few players who started out either slow or started out hot, and kind of tried to look at what their current average is, what I would have thought at the start of the season I would have estimated for an average, and compared to that to the top of the line, and then what reached that average, what it would mean they'd average for the rest of the season. So looking at that, first we got like Heeney. So this was one that many jumped off in round 2, and at that point he was not averaging well at all, and we can now see his 3, 4 and 5 scores, which has got him to a current average of 99.4. Now looking at the start of the season, we may have, this is probably a high estimate considering I went back and looked at what defenders have averaged in the past for top of the line and seen it is actually about 105 from the top 10 we picked, but I put 110. So looking at this based off the total points, we would be expecting that to be 2,530 based on 23 games. Now there's 18 games left, which leaves 2,033 total points to be scored if we take away the 497, meaning we're expecting an average for the rest of the season of 112.94. And this is a variance to the estimate average of an increase of 2.94. So we're expecting him to go 2.94 points better than our estimate. And moving across from there, I looked at the positions. So this is what the top line average is for, kind of putting, this is what I think will be around about the top 10s. I think midfield previously has been about 115. It's what we end up with. But it could go 120 this year, as there's been a lot of high scoring. And moving on to that, we see that the variance to estimate to the top of the line average is 7.94, because I've put in 105, which in general is what they've scored, which means I think that he's going to go 7.94 points above the top of line defender average, which is quite good. Now, what I did was I put for this a -5 difference. So as long as their variance in average was above -5 points compared to the top of the line, they were probably someone that you could look at picking if you like them. Now, I guess the important thing to look at with this and keep in mind is the fact that estimate has to be pretty confident. And this can vary. Like, you might think Hayden Young could average 115, or you could change this as the weeks go by, as roles changes. Like, this is probably what I looked at Young at the start of the season, probably being on average, probably more 105. But and if we put 105, you can see that the average for the rest of the season is 106, and he still beats that -5 difference. So if we go 105, which is probably a bit more accurate, although he is in midfield, which is probably why I did estimate that up to 110, that's where we would end up. Now, the thing is like, obviously there's other things to think about, like breakout, etc. But this is the kind of thing you can think about. So, and where you might want to think about, what they're priced at, and whether it's worth, going for them. Because, for example, if we look at Serong, so he started off really hot, and as you can see, it has pulled back in the last 2 rounds. His current average is still 128, and I estimated 115. But you could, this is where the estimate's fluid. Like, this could be what you think. I think a lot of people didn't really think Serong would go more than 120 at the start of the year. So I think 115 is quite fair. And looking at that, I would then estimate that he's going to go 111 for the rest of the season to pull back his average to this 115. And that's 3.61 below what I estimated his average to be. But the variance to the top line is still less than that -5. So you're still happy to pick Serong based on your estimate, because looking at that, I think that he is still going to be around about the mark, and that's what we kind of look for in players. Now, the other thing to think about this as well is assuming price in this, but you can do this with all the players. Like if you're looking at Steele versus maybe say like a Flanders, for example. I mean, position makes a difference. So like, you know, your forward line, we probably, you know, Flanders is probably a definite, whereas like a Steele is a maybe in the midfield. So maybe you want to use midfielders and go Steele versus Butters and look at that as well, and look at price, which they are around about the same. I thought another one that was interesting is probably Luke Ryan and even Heeney, for example. So I'll look at both of these. So these guys are both players that are actually overperforming massively. So we see that Ryan's current average is 135. And I think, you know, we would have estimated start of season 110. Now, I think that this is one of those ones where you look at it and you go, okay, Fremantle's play style is actually letting him score a lot better. So do I think I should increase this average? Which I would probably say yes. I'd probably say he's probably more going to be around the 115 mark. And doing the 115 mark, we see that then his average for the rest of the season, I just want to see this change. Yep, it did. That means that I think that he's going to go 109 from here. Now, you might disagree with that, and you might go, well, I think he's actually going to go 120. And that means, you know, his average only comes to 115. And if we move across, we then see, well, yeah, that's 10 points above the estimated top of line. So, yeah, he's still worth picking. But if we pull it back to maybe a bit more of a, okay, this is a worst case, is 110, you know, he's 2.11 below that average we think that the defenders are going to get. But it's still within the parameter of that -5, which is like, you know, you give yourself a little bit of leeway there. But I do think it's important to think about these things, because I'm thinking he's going to go 102 for the rest of the season, whereas a guy like Nick Martin, who I've gone 63.93, and I'm only estimating his current average is 105. I'm estimating he might go 108 for the rest of the season, is actually going to have a better average over that time. Now, whether this happens is interesting, but is up to chance, really. But it is interesting to think about how these numbers kind of all play out, because history has shown that this is how it plays out. Like, it's very, very, you know, the amount of players that have averaged 135 for a season, there's not many. I think Neil did it 1 year, Gawn's done it, Grundy's done it 1 year, but not, you know, those are rucks, solo rucks, and, you know, Brownlow midfielders that are doing that. Does Luke Ryan fit into that mold? I guess he does fit into it with, you know, the amount of ball he's getting. But like, for example, last week, he was on 60 something at the third quarter, and this pumped 80 points in the last. So, you know, if he doesn't have that last quarter, that's at, you know, 90. If we look at a 90 or even 100, that brings his average down 10 points last week, you know, compared to what it is. Now, it didn't happen, obviously. So, you know, it's if, buts and maybes, but still, it is something to think about, you know, how this could change pretty quickly, because we've only got a small sample size. This is 5 games. If he pulls back to 105 for the next, you know, 2 or 3 games, that could affect his average quite a bit. You know, if we go, let's say he goes the next 2 games, he goes 105. That brings his total points to 888 divided by 7, and his average is already pulled back to 126. So is that, you know, a bit unders? Well, maybe, but, you know, you never know. Maybe he had the teams that were easy to score against in the defense. You know, I'd suggest probably not, but I think think Port were actually not too bad to score against from your back line. I think that happens with the bigger teams, the better teams, because they're getting the ball in there more, which gives the defenders more chance to get the ball. So I just think it's something interesting to think about. Now, as you can see, there is a no for Heeney. Now, I think that this is probably the estimate average is probably unders. Now, if we're all serious, this is probably where we were thinking. Even 100, like 105 to 100 is probably what we were thinking at the start of the season. But Heeney's been getting given a lot of midfield time. So this is where we can look at this and we can go, all right, I actually think he can go, probably the way Heeney's going 120. Now, if we make that 120, the estimate, average for the rest of the season is still 113, which is 6.72 points less than my estimated average for the year. And that's a long way. That's what 31 points difference to his current average. Now, whether that happens or not, we don't know. But this is just kind of thing you want to look at. But even in saying that, we still see that even with this, his variance to the forward line, top of line average, which I have put as 100 this year, which I think is fair because I think there's only going to be 4 to 5 players who actually go above that. You'll see that he's still 13.28 points above. So he's definitely worth getting. Now, what this doesn't take into account, obviously, is cash. And the other thing is it doesn't take into account or it does take into account position, but rookies can't be really used for this because, their cash starts so low. Like, for example, when I was looking at estimating last year, like a Sheasel, for example, his average was 99 last year, which is, 6 points less than a 105, which would say not to pick him. But because he started off as a price of 200K, you're definitely taking that for a 99 pick. So this is probably solely basing on your primos. It's not looking at your rookies, which, would be a whole different set of parameters because we'd have, for a rookie, you're probably happy with a 60 to a 70, which means if he's going a 90, he's way above that. I guess that's where we look at it different. Now, I did actually put Steele here, and so his current average is 130, and I think at the start of the season we would have said 110. That was probably being generous as well, and that would have been definitely not. Now, we've seen, and I think everyone who's watched Steele has seen that he is moving a lot better than what we thought he might be, and with no Brad Crouch in there, he's getting a lot more of the ball. So putting that up to a 120 and still leaves him as someone we could potentially look at. But as I said, this is where you want to be looking at, price. Like, would it be worth paying 625K for Jack Steele to get 2.78 less than what I'm estimating his average will be for the year? 13 points less than his current average for the rest of the year. Compared to someone like Hayden Young, who's 525K, I think, around about his starting price. And I'm going to get 1.56 points better than what I think he's going to average for the year. And that's only at 105, which is probably low for him. And also 1.56 points more than what the defender at the top of the line is going to score. Now, hopefully there's some of you still here because I know that a lot of people will be looking at this and go, oh, well, you're estimating. That's, a lot of this is just bull crap. You can pull numbers out of anywhere, I guess. It doesn't really make sense. I think that, Ryan's going to continue at 130, but statistically, the game says that it is very, very unlikely that a Luke Ryan and Isaac Heeney continue to score the way they are. It's, statistically, I don't know if there's ever been a player that's averaged 144. That comes along with, players getting tired, coming closer to the end of the season, injuries. Injuries don't really affect average, which is why this is also probably a bit better than total points. But, historically, it shows that players will fall back to the mean, whether that is scoring higher than their current low average or scoring a bit lower than their current high average. And I have done another sheet to illustrate this, which is shown here. So what I did, and I might get rid of these frozen bits because I thought this would be a bit easier to see, but it really isn't. So I took a few of the players that I remember from last year that either started off really well or started off badly. So the first of these was Nick Dacos, who averaged, 133.2 at round 5. So this was his average at round 5 was 133.2. And a lot of people would have thought, at this rate, he was, if you remember Nick Dacos last year, he just looked unstoppable. He was running and getting everything through from their back line through their midfield, and it just looked like he was there for every handball receive. He was kicking these late goals. He was everywhere, and 125 didn't seem unreasonable. Now, if we looked at this as a variance to the top of the line, he was scoring 28 points above what ended up being around about the end top of the line for defenders at that point, which was 105. Now, I put an estimate for the year average, which was 115, which is actually probably a lot higher than anyone probably thought at that point of year. We probably were looking at 105 to 110, but I'll be generous and go 115 as a start of year estimate. Now, as I said, your estimate's fluid. You could think it's more than this or less than this or whatever, but anyway, this is what I think once we saw the change in role, we probably thought he might end up at. And in the end, looking at the total points, so don't worry about these letters. This was just so I remember where the formulas all worked. But total points estimate would have been 2645 based off this. And that means he was going to score 1979 for the rest of the season. The average for the rest of the season to hit the estimate was going to be 109.94. And this meant that compared to what he was averaging, he was going to average 23.26 points less. And I went and looked, and we actually found his average did come down to 116.3, which means we were only 1.3 points off with that estimate. Now, I actually did these estimates before I looked at the averages, and they just turned out to be close. And I actually thought it was interesting that Merritt and Dacos were the same. But this meant that his actual rest of season average was 110. So that's 23 points less than the points he had already scored. I think at that point he was probably priced, 600s. And this is what I mean. Like, if you'd got him in at that point, you were chasing points. Now, there's another thing I forgot to mention is probably ownership. You want to be safe in that, ownership as well, which is something also to take into account. But this is looking strictly at numbers and what to expect from players going forward. And, he went, the estimate said he'd go 109.94. His end of year average was 116, and he ended up going 110 for the rest of the season from round 5. Which meant that our estimate was only a 0.72 variance. And of course, he only played 15 extra games after round 5, so 20 in total. And this was due to injury. But this is something also that you can say that injuries are unlucky, but this comes with fatigue throughout the season. Injuries come. And I don't think it's unfair to base this calculation off of an average that is affected by injuries, because injuries happen to all players, no matter how fit they are, unless it's Jack Crisp. But seriously, I think it is relevant that we keep this in mind. End of the day, his estimate average variance to the top of the line was still 4.94 points over, based on his rest of season average compared to what the top of the line was. So he's still good to pick. He was still 4.94 points above the top of the line average. And his actual average variance to his estimate variance was 1.3. And this was what? Variance to estimate fair. G take M. What's G take M? G is estimate year average. Take his average for the rest of the season was 6. So, those two were just more like just to see the numbers. But end of the day, this is what you can look at when looking at players. And I think we see that with Zach Merritt. So Zach Merritt started off slow, probably averaged 107. I probably expect him to go around 117. That's probably, I think we all thought he'd be 117 to 120-ish last year. It was only him and Parrish in that midfield, and Merritt's always been a really good good at getting the ball, but he's also always been a bit more of a slow starter, which we haven't actually seen this year. So going to be interesting to see how he holds through. Now, the average for the rest of the season, said basing on 117, would mean that he would have gone 119.56, and that's 11.76 points over his average at round 5. And his average at the end of the year ended up being 116.3. So he was only 0.7 points off. And that was 118.82 for the rest of the season. So at that point, you could have got a player who averaged 11 points more through merit than you could have got with Dacos, who was averaging at the time 133. The variance to the rest of the season estimate was only 0.73, and he played 17 games, so 22 total. And but even looking at this, you could still make an argument that Dacos was better because as a defender, the variance to the top of the line was higher, 4.94 compared to 4.56. So merit was only 4.56 higher than the top of line average estimate that I had listed in, which I think was pretty bang on. I mean, you could put it to 120, but 115 was about it, looking at, some teams and some players at the end of the year. I think Bont's probably the outlier, but you're always going to get outliers with this, and that's where you got to look at players and make your estimate. I think we all would have probably estimated Bont 123-ish, so but that's where the numbers obviously change. And as I said, price is what you've got to take into this. Even with players who did get injured at the start of the season, so Tom Stewart, and I think Gawn's actually a really good one to look at. So at the start of the season, I think a lot of us would have gone maybe an estimate of 105, even lower with Grundy. If I put something lower, it obviously pulls this closer. But end of the day, with an average of 105, I thought he'd go 109.28, which the estimate the rest of the season, that's 19.68 points more than his average through the first 5 rounds. And his actual average end of year was 104.5. So the calculation was really close, which meant that his rest of the season average was 109.4, which got him 19.8 points. 19.8 points more for the rest of the season, which is pretty much the same. And, a 0.12 variance. 1,641 points in total because he missed a few through injury. So this does take into account injury. And if we look at this, this actually had a 0 in it, which is why this probably came back a bit more to the meme as well. But it is important to keep those things in mind. He was 0.72 below, which I said is still higher than the 0.5, so he gets a yes for usage. But obviously there could have been better options to pick from. But as I said, that's 0.72 for the rest of the season. He was below. He was 5 points for an average for the rest of the year. For the year, but thinking about that, he was 5.5 lower. But looking at that, you'd still be happy with the 109, which was only 0.72 off of that estimate, which was his rest of year average. Clayton Oliver was another one who was high, so he was going at 128, and we probably would have thought he was going to go 120. So his variance to top of line was 13. We already thought he was going to go 5 better than the top of line average anyway. Out of the games left, he'd have to average 117, which was 10.22 points lower than his current average. His average at the end of the year was 120.6, so pretty close to that. I'm not sure whether I just put the averages in and it was just good memory or it was just really lucky. But I think, 120, we all thought Clayton Oliver could easily do that. Now, Oliver, that means his actual rest of season average was 116. So it was actually lower than the estimate was. And he went 1.78 points lower than what we'd variance the rest of the season. Yeah, so 1.7.8. So that's the difference between what we estimated and what his actual season average was. But he was still 2.78 points better than what we thought the average mid would go. So yes, you'd still pick him. But as I said, looking at all these numbers, this is good to see what you think, you're going to get out of them going forward. But you need to combine this with what their price is now. So for example, Hogs, for example, he was 96.2, estimated 105, meant 107 for the rest of the year, which was 11 points more. His average at the end of the year was 101, so he didn't quite get there, but he still had an actual rest of season average of 103, which was good for a forward. Our 100 average was, I don't know, it probably was 105 last year, but I guess F5, F6 wasn't very deep. It was Cogs, Butters, Rosie, and Taranto last year. They were the big four. And then there was a scattering of others, but he was only 7.02 less, and he was still 7.44 points above the top of an average for last year. Is that right? I think it is. Oh no, this is going to the other sheet where I probably estimated lower for the current year. Oh no, it's still 100. But anyway, you kind of see the point. So I guess end of the day, the whole point of this video was just to look at players and go, will the average stick? And if it doesn't stick, what does this mean for the rest of the year? Because a lot of the time we get caught up in bringing in a Luke Ryan, for example, because he's averaging, the 135, but then the down games come and this pushes back down. And that's where you could find that maybe you were better off going a Hayden Young, who is 100K less and looks to be going to push his average up. Because, to hit the estimate currently, Ryan would have to score 102, which means he'd be going 4 points lower than what we're expecting Young for the rest of the year. Now, as I said, these estimates are fluid. You could expect this is 120, and then the argument changes. You're actually getting 9 points extra out of Ryan over Young, but Young is 100K less than Ryan at the moment. So I guess in saying that, it's just something to think about because, statistically things say Luke Ryan and Isaac Heeney will not average this for the rest of the season, and down gains will come. We've already seen this with Serong, and we've already seen this with Tom Green, and Luke Jackson after his first couple games, averaging 130. Nick Martin averaging low, now going 136, 133 and pushing it back up to 105. Young getting it up to a 99. These things statistically happen, and it's good to keep them in mind. So with that, if you're still here and you've got to the rest of the video, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've got something out of it. Probably a lot of jibber jabber, but I think it is important to keep in mind the points of yesterday you cannot get. And it's going forward, you need to look at the player, look at what you think they're going to average, and look at what that means that they're going to score for the rest of the season. So hopefully this all kind of makes sense. It probably doesn't. You probably skip past this or stop the video probably 15 minutes ago. But if you got to the end, glad you're here. Glad that you found it interesting enough to stick around. And I guess we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.